Welcome, Friday night. Welcome to you all. You're in a festival. And this festival, part of it was always focusing on a phenomenon that draws a lot of attention and a lot of money, and it's called anti-ageism. And it bothered mankind for centuries, for millenniaries. You know, the oldest fiction in humanity, Gilgamesh epic, is focusing and driven by the pursuit of immortality. That's the basic move. And from then on, you can go through history in variation. We still do the same thing. I noticed that Ray Kurzweil, an entrepreneur in California, he takes about every day 157 pills to keep himself up to date for the moment when science will make him immortal by treatment. Now, nature itself provides samples where it actually achieves something like immortality. The jellyfish, there's a jellyfish, a special one, that in a way is biologically immortal. And on the other side, technology, particularly in chemistry, they have found stuff, you call it whatever, PFAS, that is what they call immortal chemical. So on both sides, on the makeability as well as on the patterns provided by nature, you have a kind of support to pursue this kind of great goal against death. And today we have a wonderful scholar, not new to Heidelberg friends and Heidelberg DAI people. He has written a book, Why We Die. And in a way, from the angle of what is done in research, and millions are spent in California on this issue, millions. There's a Google lab that does nothing else but pursue, not happiness too, probably, but immortality. Now, Venki Ramakrishnan, as you know, some of them know him, Nobel Prize winner. He has been the president of the Royal Society, and it needs such a scholar in order to focus on this really most important question, why we die. And I'm very happy here to have this wonderful question, which is a crucial question, existential question, touches almost on every field of what we call Geist and research in our little community anyway. And we're very happy to have you here in Heidelberg. Thank you for coming.
So, first of all, thank you for having me, and it's a real pleasure to be back here in Heidelberg. I often come here to visit EMBL, which is up the hill, but I have been at DAI once before to talk about my research on ribosomes. So anyway, today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this new book that I've written, and it's this month was translated into German, was published in German, so you can read it in whatever language you like. What have we learned from the book? One is that awareness of mortality has driven us since we were humans. And there's an interesting observation to make, and that is we may be the only species that's aware of mortality. So animals know about death, but they don't know that they're all going to die one day after a certain lifespan. At least there's no evidence for it. And because we have been aware of our mortality, ever since we became aware, it has driven human culture in many different ways. And I like to show, this is the tomb of Tutankhamun, which was incidentally first discovered almost exactly 100 years ago, okay? And it was discovered by Howard Carter, an English Egyptologist. And when they opened the tombs, they found the tombs were sealed. So nobody had gone into those tombs for several thousand years. And inside, they found all these amazingly beautiful artifacts because it was one of the few tombs that had not been, just essentially plundered over the centuries. It was intact. And you could see the pharaoh's, sarcophage, and then you could see, this funerary mask, which was made of gold, and inside there was a mummified pharaoh. And so the question is, why was there all this elaborate, beautiful artifacts if nobody was allowed to go in? Who was going to see these things? Well, the Egyptians believed that in due course, this corpse would come alive and be brought to the gates of, entry to the next world. And this Anubis, who's a jackal-headed god, would take the heart of this dead person, now no longer dead, I suppose, and weigh it against a feather. And if the heart was lighter than the feather, the person was considered pure, and they would be allowed to pass through and live an eternal life of happiness. So the Egyptians had this very elaborate idea of what would happen about death, after death. And it involved, the body coming alive, and it also involved an immortal soul and another world into which they pass on. And this is how often humans have viewed death. They've viewed death, as a transition in order to try and deny to themselves the finality of death. Yeah. And there are several strategies that humans have adopted to avoid death, in other words, to be immortal. And there are 4 plans which Stephen Cave, the philosopher who's written a book called Immortality, calls Plan A, B, C, and D. So if you look at Plan A, it's simply not to die, okay? And even the Emperor Qin of China, the person who first unified China, he actually had all of these plans in mind. But Plan A, not to die, was he would take all kinds of compounds and potions, and he would even send emissaries to look for elixirs of life. And, many of these people were afraid to come back because they obviously there wasn't any such thing. They thought he would behead them because they didn't come back with it. And he also had this big tomb, and with a terracotta army, in Xi'an, so that when he came back alive, there'd be this army to protect him. Anyway, so that Plan A is not to die. Plan B is that you die, but you believe you can be bodily resurrected. And, all the Abrahamic religions, so Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, these Abrahamic religions all believe in bodily resurrection. So they believe that on the day of judgment, when Gabriel blows his trumpet, everybody will come alive, and, then they will be judged. And that's why these religions traditionally used to insist on cremation. And in fact, in Judaism and Islam, it's still the case that you must bury the body, and you must bury it very quickly, within 24 hours, and so on. And that's because of, this belief. And then there are Eastern religions which say, well, the body may die. In fact, you burn the body, you cremate it. But it doesn't matter, because there's an immortal soul, and the soul can occupy other bodies in a reincarnation. And then this can go on, cycle after cycle, and eventually, in some cases, like in Buddhism, the soul can escape and find nirvana and be immortal by itself. without a body. But again, death is viewed as a transition. And then there's Plan D, which, after the Enlightenment and the growth of science and rationality, Plan B and C, people were beginning to be a little doubtful that they were actually real plans. And so they would say, well, people have a terrible fear of a different kind of death, which is to be forgotten. And so they say, well, you may die, but if you can live on through your works. So if you would, write a great symphony like Beethoven, or, do something revolutionary like Einstein, then you're going to be immortal in a different way, in a different sense. Or you can be immortal through monuments. So in the old days, the pharaohs built pyramids. Nowadays, billionaires will endow buildings, or hospitals, and it will be called the so-and-so hospital, after their name. And the idea is that they will live on even after they have died. And of course, there's one kind of immortality that's available to most people, and that is you can be immortal through your children. You pass on your genes to your children, and so in some sense, some part of you is living on through your children and their children and so on. So these are the plans. But as I said, with the growth of rationality, these other plans don't look so good. Even Plan D, Woody Allen said, I don't want to live on through my works. I want to live on by not dying. And he said, I don't want to live on in the hearts of my fans. I want to live on in my apartment. And so, people know the distinction between not actually dying and, these other sort of psychological ways of avoiding death. So a lot of emphasis now is on Plan A, which is not to die. And that leads to the question of lifespans. How long do we actually have to live? And what does that mean? So lifespan can vary enormously among species, but it doesn't mean that aging is programmed. And I'll come to that in a second, but first I want to show you these species. So here you have an insect. This mayfly, once it reaches that final stage of a mayfly, that is, it comes out of the larval stage, it only lives for a day and then it dies, okay? So it has a very short life. The monarch butterfly is interesting because it has 3 completely different life cycles. And one of them is only for weeks, but one of them lasts for several months. Each time it dies, goes into the next phase, then it dies, goes into the 3rd phase, and then comes back to phase 1. It's almost as if it's 3 different lives, each with its own pattern that then repeats. But still, weeks to months, okay? But at the other end, you have very long-lived species. So the Galapagos tortoise can live, some say it can live up to 200 years. And, bowhead whale. And that, by the way, is an interesting proposition that there might be a Galapagos tortoise that is alive today that might have met Darwin, 150 years ago. Okay, so that's an interesting thought. And then you have a whale, and you have the Greenland shark, which can live several hundred years. And so you have this wide variation in lifespan. And if you look at lifespan, it's roughly correlated with size within the same class of animals. So if you look at mammals, these dots represent lifespan of different species. And you can see, you can roughly fit it to a power law. This is a log plot, so it's not linear. But nevertheless, you can fit it to some sort of power law. It's showing that there's a rough relationship between size and lifespan. Of course, there are lots of outliers. These are just scattered, but, you have these extreme outliers like this Greenland shark or the Galapagos tortoise, which is not actually a mammal, but I've put it on the graph here. So why is that? Well, this comes to the reason about whether aging is programmed or not. And the point is that aging, most people believe, is not programmed, but rather evolution doesn't care whether you live a very long time or not. All that evolution cares about is how successful are you at passing on your genes, because it's the genes that are selected for, okay? Now, if you're a small animal like a mouse, okay, each species gets a certain amount of resources. For example, food and, to make energy and so on, and to fight infections, to live. And those resources, but also to get food, takes up energy. So you use up energy to get food. I mean, now we humans don't, but traditionally, most species have to really work hard to get the resources that they need to survive. So the question is, how would you spend those resources? Now, if you're a mouse, there's a choice. You could spend those resources to maintain and repair the mouse's body so that it lives for a very long time, or you could spend the same resources for rapid growth and maturation and producing lots of offspring. Now, in the mouse, the equation is clearly for rapid growth and maturation. Why? Because if you spent it instead on maintenance and repair and had fewer offspring, you wouldn't live longer because you would be eaten by a predator, or you would die of starvation or flood or something like that. So if you had genes that evolved to make a mouse live longer, those genes would not really be selected for, because it would never actually reach old age. So it's more advantageous for a mouse to grow fast and produce lots of offspring. For larger animals, the equation is different. It's actually advantageous to live longer. You may take a longer time to find a mate. You may have a slower metabolism, and therefore, you may have a longer gestation period, longer childhood period. So it pays to live longer. Now, there are some examples which also illustrate this, and that is, look at this thing called the Brandt's bat. So bats are all these outliers here. They're very small. They're even smaller than a mouse, many of them. Why is it that Brandt's bat can live 20 times longer than a typical mouse? Because bats can fly, so they can escape predators, and they can forage over wide areas, so they're less likely to starve. They're also better protected in these caves, hanging upside down. And so it pays for evolution to select for bats that live longer, because over a longer life, they'll have more offspring. So that's the sort of general idea. And by the way, these birds, like this is a very long-lived bird. Birds tend to live generally longer than mammals, terrestrial mammals of the same size, precisely for that reason, that birds can fly and escape predation. And just while we're at it, look at humans. We're well above the graph, okay? So humans almost live twice as long as you might expect given our size. And that's possibly because human lifespan really dramatically increased about 40,000 years ago. I'm not talking about the recent health advances, because even before the recent health advances, there were people living to be a long life. For example, Michelangelo lived to be 89 years old, okay? So, but I am talking about maximum lifespan may have expanded about 40,000 years ago. And then Jakob alluded to this jellyfish, which doesn't age. So there are some species which don't show obvious signs of aging. And this is because they constantly regenerate themselves. But it doesn't mean that they don't age. It means that they age very slowly. And typically in the wild, they die of other reasons before they get to be old. So that's really what they mean by saying they're biologically immortal. If you actually waited long enough and protected it, it too would age over a longer period. So given all this, what's our natural lifespan today, for humans? Do we have a natural limit? Yes, actually we do. But it may be theoretically be possible to exceed it, okay? And I'll try to explain what that's about. So the current record holder is this woman, Jeanne Calment, shown in a typical pose, by the way, because until she was well over 100. She smoked a cigarette and had a glass of port every day after lunch. Okay, I would not recommend that as an anti-aging measure. In fact, it's likely to shorten your age. So she was simply had a very good luck. Okay, she may have been lucky with her genes, but she was also lucky beyond that. Otherwise, normally she should have died of lung cancer much earlier. Okay, but anyway, she holds the record at 122. And this is what I said. But one thing she also had was about a kilogram of chocolate every week. Okay, and I wouldn't recommend the cigarettes and the port, but I would personally, I would go for the chocolate myself. Okay, and she died in 1997, and despite the fact that there are more centenarians now than there were 30 years ago, no one has lived past 120 since that time. And so it may be that she was like an extreme outlier. Most people seem to, even the very rare long-lived individuals reach 110, and then by 115, they're in decline, and then before 120, they tend to die off. And so that's the situation. Now, as I said, the number of centenarians is growing, and that's because the number of people reaching 80s is growing thanks to modern medicine. And enough of them, simply by accident or good luck, survive to 100. And so the number of centenarians are growing, but the number of supercentenarians, these are people who are over 110, seems not to be growing by much. Okay, and there's some debate about that, but Tom Pearls, who studies centenarians in the Boston area, told me that he doesn't see an increase in the number of supercentenarians. So that means that we have a natural limit to our maximum lifespan. That is, if everything went right and nothing happened, and you had the right combination of genes, and you were lucky to avoid all sorts of problems, infections, cancer, etc., then you might hope to live to be 110 or 120, but that would be an extreme case. And so that would be the limit. So what is it that is causing this? Well, it's basically aging, okay? Aging, people ask me, what is aging and what's the difference between aging and death? Well, aging is the accumulation of changes and damage that lead to increased loss of function over time. It's not just damage in the sense of chemical damage, but it's also changes which are important biologically early on, but later on they cause problems like aging. So you remember I talked to you about evolution doesn't care how long you live, but it's actually worse than that. Evolution, if something benefits you early in life and gets you to adulthood with more probability and gets you to reproduce with more probability, evolution will select for that, even if it causes you to age later, okay? So there are many sources of aging or causes of aging that actually might be helping us to prevent cancer early in life. And because they exist, because they've evolved for that, they exist, but they cause us to age later in life. And as I said, evolution doesn't care so much about what happens then. And so aging is the accumulation of, so some of these things are changes. They're not necessarily what you'd call damage, but they're actually normal biological processes, like changes to our DNA or changes to the ends of our chromosomes, which become shorter. Those are all actual biological processes that happen and that cause aging later. And other things are damage. They're like damage due to external causes, like DNA damage due to radiation or chemicals, or just the environment, or damage to various other components. Now, what about death? Well, death is another strange thing, because while we're alive, millions of cells in us die all the time. And in fact, we don't even notice it. But not only is that we don't notice it, but many of those cells are required to die in order to keep us alive. It's part of normal function for our cells to die, many of our cells to die. And the converse is also true. That is, at the moment of your death, most of your cells are still alive. And that's why, for example, I don't know what it's like in Germany, but in the US, you can declare on your driver's license that if you've died of a sudden disease or heart attack or an accident, you can donate your organs to somebody. So that means your organs are completely functional, or many of them can be, and they can benefit some other person who needs an organ transplant. So it's a peculiar thing. When you're alive, millions of cells are constantly dying, and when you're dead, the moment of death, most of your cells are still alive. So what does it mean to say that you died? It means you can no longer function as a coherent individual, as a holistic whole individual. That loss is what we think of as death. And that's due to a critical system failure. So you have aging, which leads to increasing loss of function and increases in defects in our body. And then suddenly a critical system like the heart or brain fails, and then you die. Okay, and typically, in many cases, the heart fails, and then the loss of blood supply to the brain means the brain fails eventually. So what about these causes of aging that I mentioned, the accumulated changes and damage? Well, it occurs at every level in the body. So if you start with molecules, you can have DNA damage, but the DNA damage by itself is one problem because it changes the genetic code and it may result in misfunctional program of gene expression. But it also triggers something called the DNA damage response. The DNA damage response is a response that the cell has when it detects DNA damage. And what it does is it sends the cells to either commit suicide or to reach a particular state called senescence. These senescent cells are dysfunctional. They no longer divide. They no longer carry out their normal function, but they also secrete inflammatory compounds. And the immune system then recognize that and come there and repair the damage and remove the senescent cell. So early in life, this serves a purpose because you don't want DNA damaged cells to hang around because they could be a cancer risk. And so the body has a good reason to get rid of them. And so senescent cells actually play an important role early in life, but later in life it's a problem. And I'll talk about that later. Then, each time our DNA chromosomes divide, our cells divide, our chromosomes get slightly shorter each time they divide. This is because the ends of the chromosomes, which are called telomeres, become shorter and shorter until they reach a point where their structure unravels. When their structure unravels, the cell thinks that it's a broken piece of DNA. And then it triggers this DNA damage response and sends those cells to senescence. And so the cells stop dividing. So that's why normal cells most of the cells in our body can only undergo a finite number of divisions, and then they basically stop and become senescent. And then you have changes to the DNA itself, which are chemical changes to the DNA, which alter the way that the genes are read. So, if you think of DNA, some people have thought of this as the following analogy. You can think of DNA as the script of a play, okay? But in the act of producing the play, the director will make all sorts of changes, especially the first time. They will say, oh, this doesn't work. We're going to change this, or we're going to modify this sentence, etc. So the final thing is completely annotated and keeps on being annotated as time goes by. And that sort of changes the script. So DNA is not what you would call a rigid script. The way that DNA is read changes in response to the environment and in response to time. And some of those changes, again, may have protected us against cancer early in life, but they are the cause of aging later in life because they stop the expression of genes that are important, later on that we need. And then, the orchestra, genes are code for proteins, and it's the hundreds or thousands of proteins in our cells that carry out lots of biological functions. And they have to be made correctly, they have to fold correctly and be in the right conformation, they have to be made in the right amounts. They also have to be degraded at the right time. And all of those functions break down with age. And so that's this thing called loss of proteosomes, proteostasis. So that's another problem. And then we have a complicated relationship with our environment. The cells sense nutrients. They sense both sugars and other things that provide calories, but they also sense other nutrients like amino acids. And in response to the nutrients, they control the metabolism of the cell. So early in life, you want the cells to grow. So you have nutrients and you have rapid growth, and that's good for the organism. But later in life, the rapid growth can become a problem because what happens is you start accumulating defective proteins. So you want to slow down the system so that you have a chance to get rid of the defective components. But if you keep on producing it at the same rate, then you keep on accumulating defective components, and that itself is a cause of aging. And so if this nutrient sensing system is deregulated, then you have a problem. Then another important aspect of aging are our mitochondria. Mitochondria are organelles in our cells which are descendants of bacteria. So about 2 billion years ago, an ancestral cell of ours, probably an archaean, a larger archaean cell swallowed a smaller bacterial cell. And normally, this would have been a non-event. Usually the bacteria would have been killed and digested, or the archaean might have suffered indigestion and died, okay? But in this case, what happened was that the two species decided they survived somehow. And the bacterium divided inside the archaean. And gradually they developed a symbiotic relationship. And so today, a lot of the cell's functions are basically outsourced to mitochondria. And mitochondria, in turn, have outsourced most of their genes to the host, to the larger host cell, to the nucleus. And so the two cannot get on without each other. We could not live without mitochondria. But mitochondria are where we burn fuel. We burn sugar to produce energy. And we produce energy in the form of a chemical called ATP because it's a small, high-energy molecule that can be used wherever it's needed to produce energy for chemical reactions. So, I like to think that, in the old days, there were different kinds of energy. If you wanted warmth, you would light a fire, or if you wanted to have a mill, you would use water or wind to turn a mill wheel and so on. But you couldn't use a windmill to make fire. You couldn't cook your food with a windmill. But today we have something called a universal currency. So universal currency now is rapidly becoming electricity. So all forms of energy are converted to electricity because electricity can be used for almost everything. And so ATP is something like that. It's a universal currency for energy in the cell. And mitochondria are the ones that produce it. And because that's where they oxidize sugar, that's where oxygen is taken up. And these partially reduced oxygen molecules can be very damaging. And they can cause chemical damage to the cell. And mitochondria can then also age and become dysfunctional. So that's a very important point. And in the book, I try to say that every time I visit my grandson, he's full of energy. At the end of the day, I'm exhausted, but he's still going strong, okay? And this is a typical experience of most grandparents. And so why is that? It's because my mitochondria are not functioning as well as his mitochondria, because his mitochondria are young and they've not been damaged and they're in good shape. And then, you also have cellular senescence. I talked about these cells going into the senescent state. It's normal early in life, but later in life, we start accumulating senescent cells. And that becomes a big problem because senescent cells secrete inflammatory molecules. So you have this growth in systemic inflammation. And then this inflammation can also drive more senescence and more damage to the cells. So it's a vicious cycle. And so this cellular senescence is a big problem. And then the cells in our body that are involved in generating other tissues are called stem cells. And I'll briefly talk about that later. But these stem cells are very special. They not only can divide to make more stem cells, but they can also differentiate to form tissue. So for example, you need stem cells to regenerate skin or blood cells or our immune system and so on. With the nervous system, it doesn't replace itself that much, but there is some replacement. So you also need stem cells even in the nervous system. And as we get older, the stem cells themselves become senescent. And so we have a gradual decline in the number of stem cells, but also in their quality. And this means that our ability to regenerate tissue to keep us healthy also declines with age. And this then has an effect on if cells are dysfunctional, then they cannot communicate with each other. For example, the immune system doesn't work as well when we're older. So you'll see, you go from simple things like molecules to organelles inside cells, to cells and collection of cells, to the whole body. So, you know, aging occurs at every level of complexity in our body, and they're all related. You know, these levels are not independent. They all talk to each other. For example, damage to our DNA or our genomes will affect the kind of proteins we make, and that in turn will affect the cells that we have. And it'll also go backwards. If you have inflammation, that will trigger DNA damage response and cause more damage and so on. So that, in a nutshell, is a sort of broad understanding of why we age biologically. Now, I want to point out that a lot of this research didn't come from people studying aging. You know, aging research has only become, mainstream in the last few decades. Before that, it was considered a slightly unfashionable field. You know, mainstream molecular biologists wouldn't want to study aging. In fact, there was a feeling that it's just wear and tear. Why should we bother studying it? We rather want to see how a body actually works rather than why it stops working. But it turns out some of the big breakthroughs in aging have come from strange ideas of just following your curiosity. And I'll give you just two examples. One is a drug called rapamycin, which I'll talk about a little later because it's one of the more popular drugs in the anti-aging community. But rapamycin it's a kind of antifungal compound which was discovered by a group of Canadian scientists who went to Easter Island. And the inhabitants of Easter Island called it Rapa Nui. And so when they found a species of bacterium in the soil of Easter Island that produced this antifungal compound, they called it rapamycin, after Rapa Nui. Now, this guy, Suren Sehgal, was working for IRST Lab in Canada. And he had a hunch about rapamycin. So he collaborated with some people at NIH and showed that it had activity against solid tumors. So this made him think it might be a useful anti-cancer drug. And he was interested in it. But IRST got bought by Wyeth, and they all had to shut down their labs and move to New Jersey. And no one was interested in rapamycin. But this guy was sort of committed to rapamycin. So he, without asking anybody, he grew a big batch of bacteria that produced rapamycin and made a paste of the bacteria and put it in an ice cream carton and stored it in his home freezer, and with a label marked "Don't eat," you know. And this is, and he kept it there, and then he moved it with him to New Jersey. This is before 9/11, so the customs between Canada and the U.S. were probably not that strict. And anyway, then he persuaded his bosses in Wyeth that this was interesting to pursue, and eventually they found it was an immunosuppressive drug, and then it started to be made by big pharmaceutical companies by Novartis. Well, actually the predecessor of Novartis. Sandoz, yeah, which was the predecessor of Novartis. And they, in Basel, and they were interested in it because it was an immunosuppressive drug, and so it was given to organ transplant recipients. And so that then made people interested to find out how rapamycin might be working. And so 2 Americans and an Indian in Basel, Switzerland, then followed this, and they looked for how rapamycin would have its effect on yeast, because it was known to kill yeast, or at least stop it from growing. And that's what led to the discovery of a major pathway which turns out to be involved in aging, which is related to sensing calories and other nutrients in the environment. And so a major aging pathway was discovered by a complete string of coincidences. If any one of these had not happened, then, who knows whether we would have discovered this or not. And another very curious thing came about also by a strange phenomenon, but also a strange person. So the phenomenon is that in Papua New Guinea, this is Australia, so just north of Australia, in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, you still have these tribes that live there. And this foray tribe used to come down with a disease called Kuru, which was a disease of the brain which caused them to have uncontrollable fits of laughter and then, sort of almost like epileptic fits. And then and it would kill them eventually. And so Carlton Gajdusek was an American scientist who had gone to work for a famous immunologist in Melbourne, Australia. And his boss said, well, maybe you should go check this out. And this guy was an unusual guy. He was willing to try new things and was very bold and also very stubborn. And maybe he wanted to get rid of him. It was a pain in the lab. So anyway, he sent him off to New Guinea. And this guy eventually figured out that the Kuru were eating the brains of their ancestors when they died, even of the ones that had died of Kuru. And so what was happening is when they were eating the brains of these ancestors, they did that because they wanted to absorb the spirit of their ancestors so they could remember them. It was some kind of death ritual. And he realized that maybe those brains had a component in them that was transmitting the disease to the people who ate it. And of course, there was no virus or bacteria in these brains, so there's completely a transmission without viruses or bacteria, previously completely unheard of. And for that, Carlton Gajdusek received the Nobel Prize. And it turns out that that kind of transmission is the basis of prion diseases. You may have heard in Britain they had mad cow disease. And that's exactly like Kuru. It's another Kuru-like disease, a prion-like disease. And the feeling is that Alzheimer's and other kinds of dementia, where proteins misbehave and form tangles, are like prion diseases. And maybe, of course, we don't eat the brains of Alzheimer patients, or we don't inject them into our brains. But it is possible that they may be transmissible if we did that. So that's a long way from Kuru to Alzheimer's. And Gajdusek had a strange distinction, and that is he was not only a Nobel Prize winner, he was also a convicted child molester, because after he went back to the US, he brought a lot of these boys from the Kuru tribe to educate them and so on. But while he educated them, he also had relations with them. And so he was convicted, and then he left the US and ended up dying in Norway. So why is there so much interest in aging today? Aging and death are things we have wondered about for centuries, ever since we knew about mortality. But there's a huge interest in aging now. And why is that? It's because life expectancy has gone up. So people are living a longer time than they have historically. At the same time, fertility rates have actually dropped to the lowest levels historically, except in times of war or plagues or things like that. But in normal times, fertility rates have never been this low. In Europe, in Germany, I believe it's now at 1.6, the fertility rate, which is well below replacement rate. And it's similar in the UK as well. And that's true of most developed countries. And so the combination means that the population is getting older because people are living longer, but there are fewer people being born and therefore fewer young people. And so if you look at the population age distribution, in 1966, you had a lot of people, in the 0 to 20, and then it would taper off, and above 60, it was quite a small number. Now you can see there are fewer people here, and this middle region is becoming fatter, and there are many more people living above 60 and 80 than before. And the feeling is if this trend continues, then you will have a situation where you will have a lot more people living beyond 60 and 80, and not many people, below 60 to support them. In fact, this may be a very optimistic curve. And so I don't know if this even takes into account this reduction in fertility. And so lots of governments and research organizations and foundations are putting a lot of money into aging research. And this has led to a huge explosion in longevity research. And it's resulted in a mixture of both real advances and a lot of dubious claims, okay? Because they're capitalizing on the fact that everybody is anxious about getting old and poor health, and also people fundamentally don't want to die. And so that's an issue. Now, in terms of the research, these are the three of the biggest or most prestigious journals in life sciences, and all of them publish lots of papers on aging, but there are also proliferation of journals devoted entirely to aging that have come up only in the last 10 or 20 years. And there have been more than 300,000 papers published in just the last 10 years alone on aging. And there are about 700 startups with many billions invested, okay? And some of them, Jakob mentioned Calico, which is a subsidiary of Alphabet, so the same group that owns Google. But many of you may have heard of Altos Labs, which was founded by a group of tech billionaires about a year or two ago, and with branches in California and also in Cambridge, England. And so, but there are just a huge number of these. And this has also led to dubious claims and selling all kinds of supplements to promote longevity. And so this is provided to me by Tom Cech, a famous scientist who's written a book about RNA. And he said, you can lengthen the slide says you can lengthen your telomeres on Amazon.com. You go to Amazon, you can buy all these supplements that all claim to lengthen your telomeres. And of course, whether that actually will do anything to your age or not is still debatable. But the fact is, we don't even know if they will actually lengthen your telomeres because there are no clinical trials or FDA approval for any of these things. So this is just the sort of thing you see. And but there are some promising approaches, and I want to go through a few of those towards the end. So one is I pointed out that, early in life, when you have nutrients, you want to use them to have very rapid growth, but later on in life, that kind of rapid protein synthesis is not necessarily helpful. And so it was found quite a long time ago that if you calorically restrict animals, they start to resemble much younger animals in terms of, their biology. And their lifespan increases, but also many of their markers resemble those of young mice. And so the question is, do we know what happens when you have nutrient sensing? And we do know some of the pathways that are affected by nutrient sensing. One of them is the TOR pathway, which was discovered by Michael Hall and his co-workers in Basel. And the drug rapamycin actually inhibits that TOR pathway, and it can actually mimic some of the effects of caloric restriction in the sense that mice given rapamycin tend to live longer, tend to be more active, have markers that resemble younger animals, etc. Does this mean we should all take rapamycin? Well, there are scientists, even scientists who work on rapamycin, or especially scientists who work on rapamycin, who are quietly taking it themselves, even though that's not what it's approved for. It's approved for organ transplant recipients. Well, I would say, remember that rapamycin is an immunosuppressive drug. Its whole purpose is to suppress rejection of the graft. It will make you more prone to infections. It has other side effects like preventing wounds from healing. It has effects on your insulin metabolism. There are a whole series of side effects of rapamycin. Now, if you're an organ transplant recipient, the equation is very simple. You have to take it, otherwise you'll die because you'll reject your organ, your transplanted organ. No question. But if you're a healthy individual, then I would think twice about taking rapamycin. However, this doesn't mean that it's not a promising approach, okay? So one possibility is they may be able to adjust the dose of rapamycin down so it has the benefits but not so much of the bad side effects. Another is that they might be able to modify rapamycin so it has the beneficial effects but less of the side effects. So these are all things that they can try to do. But I would say this is an ongoing research thing rather than something you ought to take right away. Now, another thing that promising thing is that I talked to you about how normal cells can become senescent cells. And early in life, senescent cells serve a useful purpose. But later in life, we have too many of them. And they accumulate, they cause inflammation, they cause more senescence, more aging in other ways. And so they basically accelerate aging. So there are drugs that are specifically designed to kill senescent cells by targeting pathways that are active in senescent cells. And so then those animals tend to also seem healthier by various criteria. So this is a promising approach, but again, it has to be tested. You have to make sure it's safe over the long term, that it doesn't kill normal cells, it doesn't have long-term side effects. So it's an ongoing program, but again, a promising approach. Now, here's a slightly macabre experiment where two animals were stapled together and their blood system was connected, okay? So that the blood would flow from one animal to its partner and then come back to itself, so you would have a connected blood system. And when they did that to a young and an old animal, they found that the old animal benefited from the young blood, and the young animal actually suffered from the old blood. And even though this is a preliminary finding, it means that you have to look to see what is different between young and old blood. You have to identify factors, then you have to see what those factors are actually doing, and then see if they can be used in in a way that can be helpful, and you have to do clinical trials. That's a long, ongoing process, and there are lots of scientists working on it. But right from the time that first paper was published, the scientists got some very creepy phone calls from rich people asking for blood. It's like Dracula, wanting blood. And not surprisingly, lots of companies sprouted up to sell blood from young donors to rich people at $8,000 a pint. They probably paid the young person maybe $80, who knows. And anyway, so that sort of, and they would, FDA tried to shut them down, and they would open up under a different name. And the whole thing became completely crazy. And one of them said that his customers didn't feel they had enough time to wait for clinical trials. Clinical trials take 20 years. These guys are 60. They don't want to wait till they're 80. They want to stay 60 now. And one of the guys who tried this is a tech billionaire named Brian Johnson. He does look rather good. He's about 40. He's my son's age. He's in his late 40s. Okay, although my son looks pretty good also, I should say, without any of this stuff. This guy spends about $2 million a year on all kinds of anti-aging, treatments. And, you mentioned there are people who take Ray Kurzweil taking, hundreds of pills. Well, this is a similar guy, but he also does hundreds of measurements of himself. And then one stage, he decided to do an experiment where he took blood from his son and gave it to himself, and then he gave blood to his father. So kind of three-way, all in the family transfusion of blood. And he tried this for a while, but I think he felt it didn't actually improve his markers, so he stopped. So another promising approach is metabolite loss. So we all make important metabolites from the chemicals, from the nutrients that we consume in our diet. So, for example, many of our vitamins are essentially molecules that act with our proteins to carry out chemical reactions. And one of those molecules, so as we get older, the idea is that we may be losing the ability to make these metabolites in the normal amounts. And so the amounts of these critical compounds are going down. So this would be an argument, for example, for vitamin supplements. And that's very popular. You go to a supermarket, I don't know what it's like in Germany, but in the US or the UK, you can get vitamins especially for old people, specially formulated for over 70, things like that. And so that's the idea. And this guy, Bruce Ames, he was very famous for a test which people use to see if a chemical is carcinogenic, if it's cancer-causing or not. And in fact, all new drugs go through something called the Ames test. But later in life, and by the way, he died at 96 just this month. So he's obviously, if he practiced what he preached, it seemed to have worked out for him. Anyway, he more than 20 years ago, actually even longer ago, he felt that mitochondria are aging. And part of the reason they're aging is they're not getting the essential ingredients that they would normally get. And that if you supplement it in the diet, then the mitochondria would become healthier. And he started advocating acetylcarnitine and lipoic acid, which are involved in mitochondrial metabolism. And he started advocating them as taking them as supplements. And in fact, I went to the supermarket the other day just to check what is in these vitamin pills. And lo and behold, if you're over 70 and you buy the over 70 vitamin, it will have acetylcarnitine and lipoic acid. So somebody in these companies is also reading this literature and incorporating it and then advertising that they're going to help you stay healthy. But then over the years, he started finding more and more compounds. And so in a review, he says, oh, you need vitamin D, you need omega-3 fatty acids, you need taurine, you need carotenoids, And eventually, it's almost like you need everything. So my view is, well, you should eat a very healthy diet, with lots of fresh fruits and vegetables and nuts, along with your fiber and and protein. But anyway, so these are the things that he advocates. And one of the more recent compounds to get a lot of attention is something called NAD, which is also involved in mitochondrial metabolism. And it's a key metabolite, not just in mitochondria, but throughout the cell, in lots of reactions, but also in energy production. And our NAD levels decline by about 30 to 40%. So we may have almost half the NAD that we had when we were young. And so there are these, now you can't just take NAD in your diet because the body has trouble absorbing it. But you can take the building blocks that the body uses to make more NAD. And two of them are called NMN and NR. And these are precursors that are involved in synthesizing NAD. And if you take them in your diet as a supplement, then it raises your NAD level, okay? And in mice, that is shown to have some benefits, like you slow down the loss of stem cells or muscle degeneration by this supplementation. And of course, there are companies that sell NMN and there are companies that sell NR, and each one claims that theirs is the better precursor, okay? And the total sales is about $300 million and is projected to be over $1 billion in just a few years. And but it doesn't mean, but by the way, the lifetime of the mice did not increase very much, okay? This means, okay, the NAD supplementation improved the health of the animals, but there were other causes of aging and eventually which got them. So the lifetime hardly changed. But nevertheless, this has become a big anti-aging supplement. And I know two Nobel laureates who take it. One of them actually is in Cambridge. And this just shows that even Nobel laureates, they may be very rational when it comes to their work or their field, but when it comes to themselves, they're just as worried about aging and dying as anybody else, okay? And they're not willing to wait for appropriate trials. And then the final thing I want to say in terms of promising approaches is perhaps the most promising, but also the most challenging. And that is when you have a fertilized egg, the fertilized egg contains within it the ability to make the entire body of the animal. And what happens is it keeps dividing until it forms what's called an early embryo. And any one of the cells in this early embryo can form any one of the tissues in the final body. But as it develops further, these cells become more specialized. So they become specialized stem cells. So certain stem cells can only produce blood cells. But of course, that's lots of different cells, like all of the cells of the immune system and the red blood cell. These cells can produce those. Then there are these other cells can produce only skin and hair, but they cannot produce blood, for example. Or others which can produce bone and cartilage and connective tissue, but they can't produce nervous system cells. And others are neural stem cells, which can produce all the cells of the nervous system. Now, this is normally a one-way traffic, okay, from fertilized egg to final thing. But a guy named Yamanaka showed that just the introduction of 4 different factors into one of these final cells could make it go backwards almost all the way here to make what are called pluripotent stem cells that could make any kind of cell. Of course, if you do this, there's a risk of cancer because you're generating these highly proliferative cells. And often when you implant these stem cells in a body and have them grow, you get tumors. But one idea is that you may want to take these cells and make them go backwards only a little bit up to this stage, not all the way back. And then they would only be able to differentiate into these, their respective cells. And I wouldn't have thought this was a very workable idea, but that shows you I'm maybe too cautious. But scientists have found that in mice, if you do this, you actually do improve the health of these mice by a variety of criteria. And so that has resulted in this whole idea of reprogramming for aging. Now, of course, reprogramming as a general idea of stem cells is an old field of regenerative medicine. For example, people are trying to regenerate cartilage or nervous system tissue, for example, for stroke, or muscle for heart attacks, or pancreatic cells for diabetics. So there's lots of uses for, and also, in the case of cancer, they're trying to, blood cancers, they're trying to replace our normal blood, cancerous blood, with new stem cells that are healthy. So this is a very, huge industry. But now you can see that aging may also become one of the targets for this regenerative industry. Now, most of the field talks about aging, and they would say they don't want to increase lifespan, because that would be a problem, but they want to simply increase health span. That is, they don't want to make you live longer, but they want to make you live a larger fraction of your life longer. Now, this idea is called compression of morbidity, which means you take the period that you're not well, you have morbidity, and you compress those periods. So instead of living 20 years with lots of problems, you may live only 2 years with lots of problems. And then before that, you're completely healthy. So that's a term coined by James Fries, who actually wrote about healthy aging. And, Altos Labs, I was at the opening of Altos Labs in Cambridge, and Rick Klausner, who's chief scientist for Altos Labs and spoke there, said their goal was to die young after a long time, okay? And so this idea is that you stay young and then you suddenly die. And I was thinking after he said that, if you're young, all your cells are healthy, why would you die? Why wouldn't they just keep on going? And so James Fries, in that same article, quoted a poem by Oliver Wendell Holmes called The Wonderful One-Horse Shay. Now, a shay is a horse carriage for one or two people. And there was this particular shay that was so perfectly constructed that all its parts would wear out exactly at the same rate, okay? So you wouldn't have a part breaking down. Everything was wearing out at exactly the same rate. And so farmer was riding along. The shay was already 100 years old and had never had any problems. He was riding along, and suddenly the entire shay disintegrated under him, and he found himself on the ground surrounded by this debris of the shay. That's what we're asking. We're asking that we will be healthy, nothing is wrong with us, and suddenly we would decline, and that's the one-horse shay idea. So you might ask, is compression of morbidity even possible? Well, you must know that over the last 50 years, and certainly over the last 150 years, but actually even over the last 50 years, our lifespan has gone up. Our life expectancy has gone up. So the first part was due to improvements in childhood mortality, infant mortality and childhood mortality. But then we started making progress with heart disease, cancer, diabetes, etc. So we started gaining at the other end, beyond 60. So now we're in the 80s for life expectancy. But the number of years spent with 4 or more morbidities has actually increased as a fraction of our lives. That means in actual numbers, we're spending more years in poor health than we did before in olden times. And this is not just true in the UK. The same thing is true in the in the UN report, that lifespan has increased and healthy years have increased, but the fraction of our lives in disability has not decreased. And we know this, this came to our attention during the COVID pandemic. All these people who are in care homes who are normally forgotten, we don't remember them. And suddenly they were in the news because of COVID. And so that's the situation. So I'm not sure it's possible. The only thing that makes it possible is that these people who live 110 years suddenly live very healthily and very suddenly decline and die. So at least there are some examples of people who have compressed morbidity, but it's also possible that they're simply lucky. that this is not something that has a very general lesson for everyone, because they may have a particular combination of genes and particular life history that they somehow and also luck, that they avoided cancer, they avoided accidents, and so on. And so they just happen to survive. Or maybe they have something it's not clear. One of the final things I want to say before my last point is that there's a big economic disparity in longevity. You know, in the UK, the difference between the top 10 and bottom 10% economically is 10 years of longevity. And in the US, it's 15 years. But if you look at the difference in healthy years, it's almost twice that. That means the poor are spending shorter lives, but a bigger fraction unhealthily, okay? And so this is a big problem. And there is a joke in the field that the best way to live a long time is to be rich, okay? And so there is this danger that as you get more and more longevity research, if it's very sophisticated and expensive, you know, who's going to benefit? Of course, the tech billionaires are going to benefit, but also very rich people and perhaps rich countries will benefit. And this may increasingly create a two-tier humanity, a long-lived, healthy humanity, and the rest who are like, you know, living as they have for a long time. So while we're waiting for all these things to happen, what can we do? Well, somebody said this is your grandmother's advice, you know, sleep, diet, and exercise. But your grandmother didn't know why this advice worked. And also your grandmother may have also given you lots of other advice that wasn't true, okay? And so, but what we now know is the underlying molecular basis for why this works. So for example, diet is related to those nutrient sensing pathways like rapamycin and TOR. And so a moderate and healthy diet is important. Sleep is important because a lot of the maintenance and repair that goes on to correct all of the changes and damage that occurred during life are repaired in the sleep cycle. So it's very, very important to have adequate sleep. And exercise is beneficial in lots of ways, not least in the ability to regenerate, you know, repair damage, but also regenerate tissue, regenerate mitochondria. So there's huge benefits of exercise. And the three of them support each other. If you exercise, you're more likely to sleep. If you sleep and exercise, you're likely to be less stressed. You're also less likely to overeat. So all of these things help each other. And so they're like a three-legged stool. There are also some things that the average person can do. You can get tests for diabetes, cholesterol, and high blood pressure because they're eminently detectable and treatable. And they will improve your health, you know, prevent poor health in old age. You can test for certain kinds of cancer, like colon or breast cancer, prostate cancer, or skin cancer. And early diagnosis will dramatically improve your chances. And sociologists have found some curious findings. One is that social isolation can increase mortality. So it's important to avoid social isolation as you get older. And that's harder for old people living alone in their apartments. And also maintaining a sense of purpose, having a sense of purpose in life actually improves, you know, your mortality. So these are, this just shows you the connection between the brain and the rest of the physiology of the body. So those are things that molecular biology now tells us why these things are useful. So I would say understanding why we age and die also offers us tools for how to live. And they also offer you tools on how to interpret the next news article in Der Spiegel or FAZ or something. You know, you read this new article about aging, you can tell whether this is nonsense or it's hyped or whether it actually makes sense because you might have an understanding of the biology. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let's take the chance to raise questions. Okay.
Hi, this was an interesting talk. At the beginning, you mentioned something that after sexual reproduction, there's no need to have a longer lifespan, yet it occurs in human beings. And so I was wondering how transmission of experience to the progeny also contributes to a longer life.
There are theories, for example, one idea is called the good mother hypothesis, which says that it's not enough to live until you reproduce. You also have to live long enough until your youngest child reaches adulthood, because otherwise, your genes won't survive. That's called the good mother hypothesis. Then there's a hypothesis to explain menopause called the grandmother hypothesis, which is that it's more advantageous to stop having children and help with the raising of your grandchildren so that, they can survive. But I think evolutionary biologists don't buy these explanations so much because they often will benefit the group at the expense of the individual and at the expense of the genes. So they would prefer much more direct evolutionary explanations because many of these sort of cultural things occur at the group level. But the group level doesn't, if you do the calculations, evolutionary calculations for gene selection, then it doesn't work at the group level unless the group is highly related genetically, like ants or bees, which are all essentially clones of each other in the colony, For them, group selection makes sense, but for humans, much less so.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. So I have a quick question. From the other side, so is there a way we can age faster and or is there a scientific basis for it?
Well, you could certainly induce DNA damage by, drinking lots of alcohol and smoking and, exposing yourself to nasty chemicals. And, and then you will automatically age faster. And of course, there are many things that cause you to age faster. One peculiar thing is stress. We don't quite understand all of the metabolic effects of stress, but clearly people under stress seem to undergo, faster aging. So I'm sure that there are lots of environmental ways in which you could age faster.
Yo, thank you for your talk. One more question concerning mitochondria.
Yeah.
So you tend to say that it's very important. UCL's Nick Lane also believes that mitochondria might be in the center of all this because, birds have more of them available. Diet and exercise do play a role in how they work. And if they dysfunction, they do play a very important role in apoptosis, ferroptosis, and cell death. So I can't see how we can address 2,000 mitochondria in one muscle cell. So how do we, want to address this problem of them aging, getting damage from free radicals? It's very difficult to think of treating those millions, billions of mitochondria.
No, it's a hard problem, but remember that the cell has ways of getting rid of damaged mitochondria by processes like autophagy. So the cell will sense damaged mitochondria and send them to be degraded. So the key really is to, first of all, keep mitochondria healthy by, ensuring healthy metabolism, but also encouraging regeneration of mitochondria and encouraging autophagy, which gets rid of defective mitochondria. So that it's a sort of statistical game that you're playing. You want to have more healthy mitochondria and fewer of the unhealthy mitochondria. But I agree, it's not an easy target. But some of those compounds, those supplements I mentioned, like NMN or NAD precursors, or that's lipoic acid and acetylcarnitine, are really directed at mitochondrial health.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. My question might be a bit personal, but I'm really curious on that. As you are researching aging and death in a way, what's your take on immortality? Would you like to be immortal?
I think, that's a hard question to ask, because, there's an old joke, which is, who would want to live to be 100? And the answer is somebody who's 99. Okay. And so, although my father is going to be 99 in January, and he's now getting to be fed up of life. So it's not always true. Anyway, but I have to say, that's a very extreme question. A more sort of, short-term question is, if somebody came to you and said, we have developed a pill, thanks to all of the billions of dollars of research, which will give you 10 years of extra healthy life. Not unhealthy. Nobody wants to live 10 years sick. But, 10 years of extra healthy life. Would you take it? And most people would take it, okay? And I have to tell you, I'm taking 2 such drugs. I'm taking a statin for my cholesterol, and I'm taking my blood pressure medicines. Why am I taking them? Well, because, they say it will keep me healthy, for a bit longer. So I would say if you did that, most people would take it. Now, you could use like a mathematician's induction theorem. If you want 10 years, then what about 20? And then what about 30? So by extrapolation, you would say, eventually most people might even say, okay, I would want to live another 100 years, but maybe not all at once.
Thank you.
Any question?
Hi, thank you very much for this talk. Do you think that the billions of dollars being invested in the industry at the moment are going to lead in the coming years to the desired effects that they wish come out of this investment? So what does your intuition tell you about maybe the next 10 years of this research? And
I think it's going to be slower than they think, just because, if you look at the example of medicines, even against very well-targeted, very highly specific diseases with a very clear pathway, it often takes 20 years from a fundamental discovery to a medicine that's used in patients. So I think they're overestimating the speed of development. But I would say perhaps in 10 or 20 years, there might be compounds that might improve health in old age. Okay, so I think that's more realistic to assume. I think it's unlikely that there are going to be things that will extend our lives, so that we all start living to be over 100 or 110 or 120, or, there's a famous bet in the aging field about whether the person who's going to be first person to live to be 150 has already been born. Okay, so 2 aging scientists have made a bet on that. And of course, I'm skeptical that that's true. It doesn't mean it'll never happen, but it'll be harder than people think.
One question: the old people from the Holy Bible, they lived Methuselah some 100 years or some this time. What have they eaten? What we don't have?
Well, first of all, I would want to see their birth and death certificates. Okay. So I think they're probably metaphorical. I'll tell you a recent example. There was this example of blue zones. So this is like Okinawa and Sardinia and places where people were thought to live for a very long time. Lots of people over 100. And then they found that when they did a careful examination and removed all the people for whom there was no good birth certificate or record, then the life expectancy dropped. Okay, so
okay. Thanks for the amazing talk. Oh, here. Yeah. Here. Also, by the way, from Abdul and from Sabine. Thanks for the nice talk. I wanted to ask actually something more related to doing research in aging rather than aging itself and the like. What are the big challenges that you have as a scientist, like, or in general, that one has when doing studies on this sort of stuff, like, I don't know, sample sizes for doing experiments with ultracentenarian and
so I tell you, there's a peculiar problem with aging, and that is, normally when you have an investigative drug, there's a clear disease target. There's a clear way to measure the disease and also measure when the patient is cured, okay? Like with cancer or some infection or things like that. And with aging, it's much harder because, the standard way would be to wait until the person dies, but the clinical trial would go on for 20 or 30 years, right? And then you'd have to look at mortality differences. So what people are trying to do is look for markers. These are biological markers that change with age, and ask if the treatment is slowing down those markers or not. And that's the way that people will do. And it leads to another question of whether aging should be considered a disease or not, because that's also, a lot of the aging researchers want it to be a disease, because then they can do clinical trials, but otherwise they have to use some other thing like dementia or osteoarthritis or some other well-characterized disease. They can't just say we're attacking aging, so it's quite complex, and I agree, it's hard.
Okay. So another question, does immortality make sense with respect to the evolution process?
So I think evolution is slightly neutral about immortality. So when I started writing the book, I thought that there was an evolutionary reason for death, that, you wanted the older members of the species to get out of the way, to make room for new combinations of genes, and younger species to have variation and so on. But when I read about it, the evolutionary biologists don't think that way. And it has to do with this group selection idea that I previously alluded to. And the problem with group selection is, if you have genes that are programming you to die, okay, then if you have a mutation that makes you longer lived, then you, on average, will produce more offspring. And so you will be selected for, okay? And so the genes that were causing you to die will disappear eventually with evolution, So I think it only makes sense for, completely eusocial species like ants or bees, where a mutation will affect the whole colony, and not just one individual. So I would say that evolution is probably neutral in terms of, whether you want it. But immortality, in terms of lifespan, but immortality, I think, is a very, almost a nonsensical concept. And I'll tell you why. Because even if you don't age biologically, like some of these hydra, before they've aged biologically, they die of other reasons. Now imagine if humans lived for 200 or 300 years, you would die of all sorts of other things. You would die of infections, you would die of accidents, you would die of cancer, you would die of, maybe climate change or starvation or war, all sorts of things, okay? So I think true immortality is really a kind of mirage. It's not really achievable,
So, well, thank you very much. I should remind you that there are a few copies there where you can be signed, but something that we haven't discussed is style and sort of side effects of this book. It gives you the drama of research, and to get the story behind rapamycin is incredible, and it's much more than just the issue of aging. It's the drama of accident and coincidence, at the same time, a incredible focused research. So it's a great book. Thank you for coming. Thank you for lecturing.